30 scandalous tactics Martin Bashir used against Princess Diana. In the pursuit of a groundbreaking interview, journalist Martin Bashir resorted to a web of deceit and manipulation that would ultimately tarnish the reputation of the BBC and leave a lasting legacy of unethical journalism. The 1995 interview with Princess Diana, conducted by Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama program, was a watershed moment in British history. It provided an unprecedented glimpse into the troubled marriage of the Princess of Wales and her struggles within the royal family. However, the methods employed by Bashir to secure this explosive interview have since been revealed as a series of scandalous tactics that preyed on Diana's vulnerabilities and exploited her fears. In this video, we'll uncover 30 scandalous tactics Martin Bashir used against Princess Diana. Number 1. Forged bank statements. Bashir's deception began with the creation of fake bank statements, a calculated move designed to manipulate and exploit Princess Diana's vulnerabilities. He commissioned a graphic designer to fabricate documents that falsely suggested individuals close to Diana, including her brother, Earl Spencer's employee, were receiving payments to spy on her. These forged bank statements were the cornerstone of Bashir's web of lies, creating a false narrative that would prey on Diana's existing fears and suspicions about being betrayed by those around her. Bashir's willingness to manufacture evidence demonstrated his disregard for journalistic ethics and his determination to secure the interview at any cost. The bank statements were not mere fabrications, but carefully crafted tools of manipulation designed to exploit Diana's emotional state and undermine her trust in those closest to her. By presenting these fake documents as undeniable proof, Bashir aimed to isolate Princess Diana and position himself as her sole confidant, someone she could trust with her deepest secrets and insecurities. Number 2. Deceiving Earl Spencer. Armed with the forged bank statements, Bashir set his sights on Earl Spencer, Diana's brother. He presented the fake documents to Earl Spencer, deceiving him into believing that individuals close to Princess Diana were being paid to betray her. This calculated act of deception was a critical step in gaining Earl Spencer's trust and securing an introduction to Princess Diana herself. Bashir's manipulation of Earl Spencer was a betrayal of the trust inherent in journalistic pursuits. By exploiting family ties and playing on Earl Spencer's protective instincts towards his sister, Bashir crossed ethical boundaries, sacrificing integrity for the sake of his pursuit. His willingness to deceive a member of Diana's inner circle demonstrated the lengths he was willing to go to secure the coveted interview, disregarding the potential consequences of his actions. Number 3. False allegations against royal staff. Bashir's campaign of deception extended beyond the forgeries and manipulation of documents. He made false allegations against Diana's private security and King Charles III's private security, suggesting they were receiving secret payments. These unfounded claims were designed to further stoke Diana's paranoia and reinforce the narrative that she was being betrayed by those closest to her. By making these false allegations, Bashir preyed on Diana's vulnerabilities and exploited her fears of being watched and monitored by the royal family and her staff. He created an atmosphere of mistrust, sowing seeds of doubt in Diana's mind about the loyalty of her inner circle. This tactic not only isolated her further, but also made her more dependent on Bashir, who positioned himself as the only one she could trust with her innermost thoughts and concerns. Number 4. Exploiting Diana's fears. Bashir's tactics were not born in a vacuum. He skillfully exploited Diana's existing fears and suspicions that she was being spied on by the royal family and her staff. Through his web of lies and fabrications, Bashir reinforced these fears, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that confirmed Diana's worst anxieties. Bashir's exploitation of Diana's fears was a calculated move that preyed on her emotional vulnerability. By playing into her pre-existing paranoia, he created an environment where his deception seemed plausible and his false narratives appeared to align with her lived experiences. This manipulation not only secured Diana's participation in the interview, but also deepened her sense of isolation and mistrust, further entrenching her in the web of deceit that Bashir had carefully constructed. Number 5. Manipulating Diana's vulnerability. Bashir's actions were not merely opportunistic. They were a calculated and deliberate exploitation of Diana's emotional state and her desire to tell her side of the story amidst her troubled marriage and public scrutiny. He recognized the vulnerable position Princess Diana found herself in and skillfully manipulated her emotions to serve his own agenda. Bashir preyed on Diana's vulnerability as a means of gaining her trust and convincing her to participate in the interview. He positioned himself as her confidant, someone who understood her struggles and could provide a platform for her voice to be heard. This manipulation of Diana's emotional state was a gross violation of journalistic ethics, prioritizing sensationalism over the well-being of his subject. By exploiting Diana's vulnerability, Bashir created an imbalance of power that allowed him to control the narrative and shape the interview to his desired outcome. His tactics were a betrayal of the trust that Princess Diana placed in him, turning her moments of vulnerability into opportunities for deception and manipulation. Number 6. Lying to BBC management. Bashir's web of deceit extended far beyond his manipulation of Princess Diana. He lied directly to BBC executives about the methods he used to secure the interview, denying that he had shown the forged documents to Earl Spencer. This blatant disregard for the truth was a violation of the trust placed in him by his employer and a clear breach of journalistic ethics. By lying to BBC management, Bashir effectively hijacked the organization's credibility and reputation for his own gain. His actions undermined the integrity of the BBC's journalistic standards and called into question the oversight and accountability measures in place. This deception not only tarnished the reputation of Panorama, one of the BBC's flagship programs, but also cast a shadow over the entire organization, raising doubts about the truthfulness of its reporting. Number 7. Creating a false narrative. At the core of Bashir's deception was the creation of a false narrative, a carefully crafted web of lies designed to manipulate and exploit Diana's vulnerabilities. He fabricated stories about Diana's friends and associates, suggesting they were untrustworthy and part of a vast conspiracy against her. This manufactured narrative played on Diana's fears and insecurities, further isolating her from her support system and making her more reliant on Bashir as her sole confidant. The false narrative was not merely a series of isolated lies, but rather a calculated and cohesive strategy to manipulate Diana's perceptions and shape her reality. By presenting a distorted view of her world, Bashir effectively created an alternate reality in which his deceptions seemed plausible and his motives appeared altruistic. This manipulation of the truth was a gross violation of journalistic ethics and a betrayal of the public's trust. Number 8. Misleading Princess Diana about her friends. Bashir's campaign of deception extended to Diana's inner circle as he falsely claimed that her friends were betraying her. By sowing seeds of doubt and mistrust, Bashir further isolated Princess Diana from her support system, making her more dependent on him for information and validation. This tactic not only preyed on Diana's vulnerabilities, but also damaged her relationships and support networks, leaving her more susceptible to Bashir's manipulation. The act of misleading Princess Diana about her friends was a calculated move designed to undermine her trust in those closest to her. By casting suspicions on her inner circle, Bashir effectively created a void that he could fill with his own false narratives and fabrications. This manipulation of Diana's personal relationships was a gross violation of her privacy and a betrayal of the trust she placed in Bashir as a journalist. Number 9. Using Diana's handwritten note. In a desperate attempt to defend himself against allegations of deceit, Bashir clung to a handwritten note from Diana, which stated she was not shown any documents. However, this note was obtained under false pretenses and in the context of Bashir's larger web of lies. Despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, Bashir used this note as a shield, attempting to deflect responsibility for his unethical actions. The use of Diana's handwritten note was a cynical manipulation of her trust and vulnerability. Bashir exploited the fact that Princess Diana believed his lies and deceptions, using her own words as a weapon against those seeking to uncover the truth. This tactic not only demonstrated a blatant disregard for journalistic ethics, but also showed a willingness to exploit and manipulate Princess Diana, even after she had already been victimized by Bashir's actions. Number 10. Exploiting Diana's mental health struggles. Bashir's tactics went beyond mere deception. He actively exploited Diana's struggles with bulimia and her feelings of worthlessness to convince her to participate in the interview. This manipulation of an individual's mental health vulnerabilities was a gross violation of ethical boundaries and a betrayal of the duty of care owed to those struggling with such issues. By preying on Diana's mental health challenges, Bashir demonstrated a callous disregard for her well-being and a willingness to sacrifice her emotional stability for the sake of his journalistic pursuit. This exploitation not only exacerbated Diana's existing struggles, but also set a dangerous precedent for how the media could manipulate and exploit individuals experiencing mental health issues. Number 11. Fabricating Stories About King Charles. In a further effort to manipulate Diana's fears and insecurities, Bashir fabricated stories about King Charles, including the false claim that he was involved in an affair with the nanny of his children. These fabrications were designed to stoke Diana's suspicions and reinforce the narrative that she was being betrayed by those closest to her. By creating and disseminating false stories about King Charles, Bashir crossed ethical boundaries and engaged in a deliberate campaign of character assassination. These fabrications not only damaged the reputation of King Charles, but also had the potential to inflict emotional harm on Princess Diana and her children. Bashir's willingness to manufacture lies and spread misinformation demonstrated a complete disregard for journalistic integrity and a willingness to cause collateral damage in pursuit of his objectives. Number 12. Creating a sense of urgency. Bashir's manipulation extended to create a false sense of urgency, convincing Princess Diana that the interview was her only chance to tell her story before a potential gag order in her divorce settlement. This tactic played on Diana's fears and insecurities, creating a false narrative of impending silence that made the interview seem like a now-or-never opportunity. By manufacturing a sense of urgency, Bashir effectively curtailed Diana's ability to fully consider the implications of her participation. This tactic exploited her emotional state and created a pressure environment in which her decision to participate in the interview was potentially compromised. Bashir's creation of this false narrative demonstrated a willingness to manipulate and coerce his subject, undermining the principles of informed consent and ethical journalism. Number 13. Misleading the public and media. Bashir's deception did not end with the airing of the infamous interview. The BBC itself became complicit in the cover-up, failing to properly investigate the allegations against Bashir and misleading the public about the true nature of how the interview was secured. The institutional failure not only protected Bashir's unethical actions, but also eroded public trust in the BBC's commitment to journalistic integrity. The BBC's decision to mislead the public and media was a betrayal of its core mission as a public service broadcaster. By obfuscating the truth and failing to hold Bashir accountable, the organization prioritized protecting its reputation over upholding ethical standards. This decision had far-reaching consequences, damaging the credibility of the BBC and casting doubt on the veracity of its reporting across all platforms. Number 14. Blaming professional jealousy. As the truth about Bashir's tactics began to emerge, he attempted to deflect criticism by claiming that the controversy was fueled by professional jealousy and discrimination against him due to his ethnicity and working-class background. This tactic not only sought to shift the blame away from his unethical actions, but also co-opted legitimate discussions about diversity and representation in the media. By playing the victim card and invoking issues of discrimination, Bashir sought to delegitimize the valid concerns raised about his unethical conduct. This tactic was a cynical attempt to manipulate public sentiment and distract from the real issue at hand, his blatant disregard for journalistic ethics, and his willingness to exploit and deceive his subjects. Bashir's claims not only undermined the seriousness of his actions, but also had the potential to erode public trust in discussions around diversity and inclusion. Number 15. Maintaining lies until unsustainable. Even in the face of mounting evidence and criticism, Bashir continued to maintain his lies and deny any wrongdoing until it became clear that his deceptions were no longer sustainable. This unwavering commitment to dishonesty demonstrated a profound lack of integrity and a willingness to prioritize self-preservation over accountability. Bashir's refusal to acknowledge and take responsibility for his actions compounded the damage caused by his initial deception. By clinging to his lies, he not only prolonged the suffering of those he had deceived, but also undermined the possibility of genuine reconciliation and healing. This obstinate refusal to engage in honest self-reflection and admit wrongdoing spoke volumes about Bashir's lack of remorse and disregard for the consequences of his actions. Number 16. Exploiting Diana's paranoia. In a particularly egregious act of manipulation, Bashir preyed upon Diana's fears that she was being spied on by MI5 and MI6, the UK security services. He used these exaggerated claims to convince Princess Diana to trust him, further isolating her from her support system and reinforcing the narrative that she was under constant surveillance. By exploiting Diana's paranoia about being monitored by intelligence agencies, Bashir tapped into deep-seated fears and insecurities. These tactics not only exacerbated Diana's existing anxieties, but also created a sense of urgency and exclusivity around the interview, positioning Bashir as the only person she could confide in without fear of being watched. This manipulation of Diana's psychological state was a gross violation of ethical boundaries and a betrayal of the trust inherent in the journalist-subject relationship. Number 17. False claims about the royal family. In a further effort to manipulate Diana's trust and reinforce his fabricated narratives, Bashir made false claims about the health and personal lives of members of the royal family. He falsely suggested that the Queen had heart problems and that Prince Edward was being treated for AIDS, preying on Diana's fears and exploiting her vulnerability. These unfounded allegations demonstrated Bashir's willingness to engage in character assassination and spread misinformation about the royal family. By making such inflammatory claims, he not only damaged the reputations of those involved, but also created an atmosphere of distrust and suspicion that further isolated Princess Diana from her support system. This tactic was a clear violation of journalistic ethics and a disregard for the potential harm caused by the dissemination of false information. Number 18. Allegations against Diana's nanny. In a particularly disturbing move, Bashir falsely suggested that Prince William and Harry's nanny, Tiggy Legg Burke, was having an affair with King Charles. This unfounded allegation not only sought to exploit Diana's insecurities and fears, but also had the potential to inflict emotional harm on her children and those closest to them. By making such a salacious and unsubstantiated claim, Bashir demonstrated a complete disregard for the well-being of those involved, including the children. This tactic not only preyed upon Diana's vulnerabilities, but also crossed ethical boundaries by implicating innocent parties in fabricated scandals. Bashir's willingness to spread such harmful lies revealed the depths of his unethical conduct and his prioritization of sensationalism over basic human decency. Number 19. Creating fake documents. At the heart of Bashir's deception was the creation of fake bank statements that purportedly showed payments to individuals close to Diana. These fabricated documents were commissioned from a graphic designer, further demonstrating the lengths Bashir was willing to go to deceive and manipulate his subject. The act of creating fake documents was not merely a minor transgression, but a calculated and premeditated attempt to manufacture evidence to support Bashir's false narratives. By presenting these forged documents as proof, he effectively created an alternate reality in which his lies seemed plausible and his deceptions appeared legitimate. This willful creation and dissemination of false evidence was a flagrant violation of journalistic ethics and a betrayal of the public's trust in the media. Number 20. Lying about the documents. Even after the existence of the fake documents came to light, Bashir continued to lie to BBC managers, denying that he had shown them to anyone. This blatant dishonesty was a further attempt to cover up his unethical actions and maintain the facade of integrity that he had constructed around the interview. Bashir's lies about the documents demonstrated a complete lack of remorse and a willingness to double down on his deceptions. By continuing to deny the truth, he not only compounded the damage caused by his initial actions, but also eroded any remaining trust in his credibility as a journalist. This refusal to acknowledge his wrongdoing spoke volumes about Bashir's priorities and his willingness to sacrifice ethical principles for personal gain. Number 21. Covering up the truth. The BBC's initial investigation in 1996 into the allegations against Bashir was criticized as woefully ineffective and a failure to uncover the truth about his methods. This institutional failure not only protected Bashir's unethical actions, but also eroded public trust in the BBC's commitment to transparency and accountability. The BBC's decision to conduct a superficial investigation and cover up the truth was a betrayal of its core values as a public service broadcaster. By failing to hold Bashir accountable and obfuscating the extent of his deception, the organization prioritized self-preservation over journalistic integrity. This decision had far-reaching consequences, casting doubt on the veracity of the BBC's reporting and its ability to self-regulate in the face of ethical breaches. Number 22. Misleading Princess Diana about her security. In a particularly insidious tactic, Bashir falsely claimed that Diana's private conversations were being bugged by the secret services, exploiting her fears and paranoia about being monitored by intelligence agencies. This lie not only reinforced Bashir's fabricated narrative, but also exacerbated Diana's feelings of vulnerability and mistrust. By misleading Princess Diana about the extent of her own security and privacy, Bashir effectively created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and betrayal. This tactic preyed on Diana's deepest insecurities and played into her existing fears about being watched and monitored by those around her. Bashir's willingness to manipulate Diana's sense of personal safety and privacy demonstrated a profound lack of ethical boundaries and a disregard for the potential psychological harm he was inflicting. Number 23. Manipulating Diana's brother. Bashir's web of deceit extended beyond Princess Diana herself, as he used the fake documents to manipulate Earl Spencer, Diana's brother. By convincing Earl Spencer that people close to Princess Diana were betraying her, Bashir secured his introduction to the princess, effectively gaining access through deception. This manipulation of family ties and exploitation of Earl Spencer's protective instincts towards his sister was a calculated act of deception. Bashir willfully undermined the trust inherent in familial relationships, using Earl Spencer's love and concern for Princess Diana as a tool to advance his own agenda. This betrayal of familial bonds and the exploitation of personal relationships for personal gain demonstrated a complete disregard for ethical boundaries and a willingness to cause collateral damage in pursuit of the interview. Number 24. Exploiting Diana's isolation. Bashir's tactics were not merely opportunistic. They were a deliberate and calculated effort to exploit Diana's feelings of isolation and paranoia. By creating a false narrative of betrayal and mistrust, Bashir effectively severed Diana's connections to her support system, leaving her increasingly dependent on him as her sole confidant. This exploitation of Diana's emotional state and social isolation was a gross violation of journalistic ethics and a betrayal of the duty of care owed to vulnerable subjects. Bashir preyed on Diana's loneliness and insecurities, positioning himself as her only ally in the world filled with deception and betrayal. This manipulation not only exacerbated Diana's mental health struggles, but also created an imbalance of power that allowed Bashir to control the narrative and shape the interview to his desired outcome. Number 25. False claims about payments. In a further attempt to reinforce his fabricated narratives and exploit Diana's fears, Bashir falsely suggested that individuals like Patrick Jeffson, Diana's private security, were being paid to keep her under surveillance. These unfounded claims not only sought to undermine Diana's trust in those closest to her, but also perpetuated the false narrative of a vast conspiracy against her. By making false claims about secret payments and surveillance, Bashir effectively created an atmosphere of constant betrayal and paranoia. This tactic preyed on Diana's vulnerabilities and played into her existing fears about being monitored and controlled by those around her. Bashir's willingness to manufacture such damaging lies demonstrated a profound lack of ethical boundaries and a disregard for the potential harm caused by the dissemination of false information. Number 26. Using Diana's vulnerabilities. At the core of Bashir's deception was the exploitation of Diana's emotional vulnerability and her desire to tell her side of the story amidst her troubled marriage and public scrutiny. He recognized the fragile state she was in and skillfully manipulated her emotions to serve his own agenda. Bashir's actions were not mere opportunism, but rather a calculated and deliberate exploitation of Diana's vulnerability. He preyed on her emotional turmoil, positioning himself as her confidant and offering a platform for her voice to be heard. This manipulation of Diana's emotional state was a gross violation of journalistic ethics, prioritizing sensationalism over her well-being and dignity. Number 27. Creating a false sense of trust. Through his web of lies and fabrications, Bashir created a false sense of trust with Earl Spencer, leading him to facilitate the introduction to Princess Diana. This betrayal of Earl Spencer's trust was a calculated act of deception designed to gain access to Princess Diana through manipulative means. By presenting a carefully curated facade of credibility and authenticity, Bashir effectively deceived Earl Spencer into believing that his intentions were honorable. This abuse of trust not only facilitated Bashir's access to Princess Diana, but also undermined the integrity of the journalist-subject relationship from the outset. Bashir's willingness to exploit personal connections and manipulate familial bonds demonstrated a profound lack of ethical boundaries and a disregard for the sanctity of trust in professional relationships. Number 28. Misleading Princess Diana about her friends. In a deliberate effort to isolate and manipulate Diana, Bashir falsely claimed that her friends were betraying her, further eroding her support system and making her more dependent on him for information and validation. This tactic not only preyed on Diana's vulnerabilities, but also damaged her relationships and support networks, leaving her more susceptible to Bashir's deception. The act of misleading Princess Diana about her friends was a calculated move designed to undermine her trust in those closest to her. By casting suspicion on her inner circle, Bashir effectively created a void that he could fill with his own false narratives and fabrications. This manipulation of Diana's personal relationships was a gross violation of her privacy and a betrayal of the trust she placed in Bashir as a journalist. Number 29. Exploiting Diana's mental health struggles. Bashir's tactics went beyond mere deception. He actively exploited Diana's struggles with bulimia and her feelings of worthlessness to convince her to participate in the interview. This manipulation of an individual's mental health vulnerabilities was a gross violation of ethical boundaries and a betrayal of the duty of care owed to those struggling with such issues. By preying on Diana's mental health challenges, Bashir demonstrated a callous disregard for her well-being and a willingness to sacrifice her emotional stability for the sake of his journalistic pursuit. This exploitation not only exacerbated Diana's existing struggles, but also set a dangerous precedent for how the media could manipulate and exploit individuals experiencing mental health issues. Number 30. Maintaining lies until unsustainable. Even in the face of mounting evidence and criticism, Bashir continued to maintain his lies and deny any wrongdoing until it became clear that his deceptions were no longer sustainable. This unwavering commitment to dishonesty demonstrated a profound lack of integrity and a willingness to prioritize self-preservation over accountability. Bashir's refusal to acknowledge and take responsibility for his actions compounded the damage caused by his initial deception. By clinging to his lies, he not only prolonged the suffering of those he had deceived, but also undermined the possibility of genuine reconciliation and healing. This obstinate refusal to engage in honest self-reflection and admit wrongdoing spoke volumes about Bashir's lack of remorse and disregard for the consequences of his actions. The deception and manipulation employed by Martin Bashir against Princess Diana were not only unethical, but also had far-reaching consequences for the individuals involved and the journalism industry as a whole. Bashir's actions eroded public trust, tarnished the reputation of the BBC, and set a dangerous precedent for the exploitation of vulnerable individuals in the pursuit of sensationalism. As we reflect on this saga, it's crucial to examine the broader implications of such unethical practices and the lasting impact they can have on the credibility of journalism. The Bashir-Diana scandal serves as a stark reminder of the importance of upholding the highest standards of integrity, transparency, and accountability in the media. We invite you, our viewers, to share your thoughts and perspectives on this matter in the comment section below. What lessons can be learned from this episode? How can we ensure that the principles of ethical journalism are upheld and that voices of vulnerable individuals are protected rather than exploited? Do you think the consequences faced by Martin Bashir and the BBC were adequate, or should there have been more stringent repercussions for their actions? Remember to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more insightful video content like this one. Thank you for watching, and until next time, bye!